Syed Abbas?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic, great. It's lovely when it works. Anyway, so could you just tell us a little bit, before we start, just tell us a little bit about your journey in journalism?
I started out training at the BBC after Westminster, doing a little course, and then I kind of carried on over at Channel 4, having done kind of radio at the World Service briefly, and also programme services. But then there was also the Channel 4 period where I just did documentaries, fell into documentaries, making all sorts of weird and wonderful documentaries at a time when Channel 4 was just emerging as the fourth channel.
Well, that's right. Yeah. It was a fantastic place to work for a while. Speaking to other people in the business, when I was at the Beeb in late 80s and early 90s in London, everyone talked about Channel 4. Well, you know, the BBC won't do it, but you can do it at Channel 4. In fact, they even did something called, I seem to remember, in the 80s, the band. No, hang on, no, this was the 90s. The band season, they put on the telly loads of stuff which wasn't allowed to be on the telly. So they had, for example, film of vivisection taking place, which was pretty horrific, filmed inside slaughterhouses and things like that. That was the brave Channel 4 of those days.
Things have changed, I gather. I'm not obviously there anymore, but they certainly gave you license to tackle all sorts of issues. I mean, I dealt largely with multicultural issues or West Asian politics, so we'd go off and interview the head of Hezbollah, for instance, at that time.
Brilliant. Well, fantastic stuff. And, it's a great training, isn't it, to do that on the job. Tim Tate, he's a documentary producer that's in Wiltshire now. He retired. He was working for Grenada and people like that for World in Action. Speaking to him a few years ago, he said, well, I pitched this idea. What he'd done is he'd come across a load of documentation that Boeing, the aircraft manufacturers, were using, allowing parts made in little workshops that had nothing to do with the aviation industry, cheap imitation parts, and Boeing were allowing them to be put into 747s and whatever. And he got evidence of this. He went to Channel 4. He went to the BBC, got nowhere. So he made he actually went and made that documentary, an hour-long documentary called On a Wing and a Prayer for Al Jazeera, amazingly.
Yes, and that's the sort of thing that happens to me as well. I think once you get rejected with certain ideas, and a lot of things get stolen as well, the integrity within the industry is not necessarily that great.
Right, that's right. You pitch an idea, and suddenly you see it pop. They reject you, and then you see it popping up under someone else's banner with a completely different spin on it.
Yeah, because the bigger companies, whether it's your Mentons or your Tiger Aspects or Wall to Wall, of course, as time went on, they get the monopolies within that sector, and they have the clout and the power. And gradually, I think all the independent producers, more and more, the smaller fry had to go and lock into those guys in order to really get a piece of the pie. So that limits the kind of freedom you have, or the kind of the variation and independence in the real sense.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, this is an enormous dumbing down that's happening right across the world. And in fact, I can remember going to the Bristol Media Group, which was supposed to be all sorts of people, including journalists, and I found that actually the whole thing entirely was dominated by the people that do advertising boards, and they seem to think of themselves as the real media, and journalists as sort of, not-for-profit hangers-on, and that seems to be the drift of journalism generally. Now, before you came on this evening, we were just, I was anyway, talking about this great storm that's supposed to be hitting us, walking around this morning, very little going on here in Bristol, just the fact that everyone has been scared to staying in their homes. And I wonder whether this is a sort of a parallel, really, with the US claims this week, again and again and again today, that Russia is about to invade Ukraine.
Well, I think, news reporting has a habit of often focusing in and maybe exaggerating something that might be there, but then inflating it to out of all proportion. And I think as soon as this story broke again, and the way that mainstream media has gone after it, it has all the hallmarks of a kind of pre-organized, campaign, a propaganda campaign, and something which is now almost de rigueur for a lot of the mainstream state television or corporate run independent TV outfits. All of them ultimately for me, all of those money trails and the trails that lead back to the interests of what I call the structural elite tend to be manifesting themselves over and over again, which again is a reason why independent voices, real critical thinking voices, and genuinely independent investigators or researchers are increasingly sidelined, in fact maligned, and perhaps even labelled as conspiracy theorists or fake news merchants. This is a sort of a standard procedure across social media that's run by the same corporate elitist interests. It's the same thing within state-run media like the BBC, which is increasingly just becoming like a voice of the neoliberal establishment, to be honest, and quite farcically and laughably at times for anybody who really knows. So it's something I lament and regret, but Russia is the new flavour of the month, and it's almost like they've got a new cycle that fear and confusion seem to be the real actual objective. So whether it's coronavirus, which it obviously happens, but it's the way you roll out things and the way you package these stories and the real purpose of them ultimately, to me, often is political weaponization for advantages which often what I call the neoliberal structural elitist establishments are wanting. So yes, there are confrontations. There is a confrontation. Russia doesn't want NATO and the West knocking on its back door. Of course, it wants access to the ports and the seas and a free route. But at the same time, whether it really would want to invade and be that heavy-handed is really questionable. And again, all you get really on mainstream Western media is that Russia is in some way, the biggest threat that the world has ever seen, just as they said when the Cold War was there. And yet, subsequently we've seen all sorts of evidence where actually the Russians were never really militarily anywhere near the Americans or the West in terms of their military capability or power. And that exists today. America outstrips any other nation. In fact, it probably outstrips in the nearest 6-7 nations that spend hugely on arms in the world. It outdoes all of its rivals combined, more or less.
Well, it's interesting you use this term conspiracy theory because this, of course, is for anyone that digs into it will find is a CIA term which was used to smear those journalists that have been getting close to the truth about the Kennedy assassination, and this is an official document which was released under the US Freedom of Information, or anyway after just a certain amount of time, from the CIA archives, where it makes it absolutely clear that we will use this term to smear good journalists who are getting to the truth about the Kennedy assassination actually originating within the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI itself, and actually maybe even Lyndon Johnson, the guy that then took over, being very much in on the plot to kill President Kennedy back in the 1960s. But there is a reason to talk about this, I suppose, which is the previous year, 1962, was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some are talking about a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse going on, where with the Americans moving this year, in fact, I think we were talking to Scott Ritter about this a couple of weeks ago, this thing called the Dark Angel, which is a mobile form of ballistic missile. It's actually a hypersonic missile. It's much faster than the original supersonic ballistic missiles of the 1960s, and actually moving that closer and closer to Moscow, meaning that one of these launches of these nuclear missiles could potentially mean that the Russians simply don't have the seconds or the minutes that they need in order to respond to destroy Western cities, whatever, London or whatever, if Moscow is going to be hit. And so the idea of mutually assured destruction, this thing which apparently has kept the peace for many decades, is being thrown out the window if these hypersonic missiles arrive on the border in Poland, places like Romania, and possibly even in Ukraine.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Russians are no slouches in terms of their intelligence and knowing what the capabilities of NATO's power is and what the potentials are. So when they do get rattled, or when they do sort of take such a strong stand on any given territory that borders them, clearly something is afoot. They've got there is an issue. But of course, the theatre of operation that NATO and the West generally is now opening up is vast, because this business in Ukraine and, of course, Belarus is just one front of a much wider set of confrontations, and we're in a situation where geopolitically, we're in a world of flux, really. So China and the maritime routes are all being challenged. The traditional routes there are being all hustled and bustled for. The Americans have kind of made it clear that in the in the Pacific, they're going to challenge China head on. In the Ukrainian or the East, or in the East-West European front, there's a challenge they're throwing there. Of course, already the theatre of operations is alive and very much well in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and across the entire West Asia region.
I mean, particularly Yemen as well, I think, is another one that, it's the worst conflict going on, the biggest humanitarian crisis. Well, it's an easily avertible crisis going on in Yemen at the moment. Could you just give us your take on what's happening there? Because this, to me, seems as if, actually, if you go back to the 100 years or so, actually Yemen was part of Saudi Arabia. This is the Arabian Peninsula, which the British and the French divided up in the Second World War. So actually, traditionally, Yemen is part of Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the whole of that region was it was a part of the Ottoman Empire for many, many centuries. And so, once what I would say would be sort of I'd call it the Anglo-Zionist Empire. Once that came, into complete power, and the British colonial empire and all the old European empires started waning, you had this emergence of what I call the Anglo-Zionist Empire, which includes America, Britain, includes their allies across Europe that are happy to, seek to go to those areas in order to secure their economic interests. The West Asians would call it plunder, probably, and pillaging. But that situation, of course, brings in the entire region. The whole region is aflame because oil and the interests of oil and the interest in trade routes and the control of that region has been a major foreign policy and an economic policy objective and necessity from a Western perspective. And that still remains the case, although it is there on the horizon that oil, etc., and carbon energies won't be so necessary. But that doesn't mean that other resources like lithium and all the other wealth of minerals, etc., that West Asia possesses isn't still twinkling in the eyes of the same people who've been, of course, plundering oil, etc., for so many decades. So the region is going to be primarily of interest and always going to be a point of conflict and wars as long as that greed for its resources is there, and as long as West Asia itself is divided internally. Now, Yemen, Bab al-Mandeb, the access to the Suez Canal, its borders with Saudi Arabia, a major client and proxy of America, is one of the major fronts that's opened up. It's also actually part of an asymmetric war, which is there and alive and well between what I call the axis of resistance, including Iran, Syria, Yemen now, and large parts of the Iraqi establishment, among others. And they arguably are fighting for their own independence, their own sovereignty, a West Asia free of Anglo-Zionist imperialism, free of arguably also Israel and its kind of Yinon plans and other belligerents in the region. So these are things that is invariably Yemen has got also sucked in. They had decades of being, if you like, plundered and raped and pillaged by the Saudis on behalf of the Western powers. And when the Houthis or the Ansarullah rose up and agreements didn't happen, of course, the war ensued. And the the Saudis launched a frightening bombing campaign, which for the last now essentially 6 years almost has just been incessant. And
yeah, well, sorry, can I just interrupt you, because one of the big changes that's happened recently, which almost got lost during COVID, was the pulling out of the UN human rights inspectors in October last year, and now we've seen the casualties in Yemen doubling.
Well, the UN has said that basically they don't have, first of all, they don't have the funds. Very interestingly, the World Food Programme said they've been forced to reduce food assistance to around 8 million people that needed it, and while at the same time describing Yemen as probably the worst humanitarian disaster in recent times. And of course, that's meant 5 million Yemenis have immediately have slipped into famine conditions, literally. And, the WFP warned that its food stocks were dangerously low and more severe reductions. And that's exactly what's rolling out. I mean, even though donors pledged about $2.23 billion, I think over the last year, the fact is the target was $3.85 billion just to get to the minimum. That was what the UN were requesting. So there's on the one hand that, but there's also been this kind of quite political role that the UN have played, because in about 2019, they started withdrawing aid for the areas which were dominated by the resistance, by Ansarullah and the Houthis, which was rather suspicious, because they made all sorts of excuses to say that the food wasn't getting to the right people and it was being
well, I mean,
misused.
This is probably also because it's more difficult to get the food to that area. But it seems quite clear now that the United Nations is not playing with a straight bat.
No, and I think this is the other contention that we have, that you have large agencies, the atomic, inspection agencies, the WHO, the UN, IMF, the World Bank. All of these global institutions are supposed to be independent, but the fact is that they get money. They need money to operate in the first place.
Well, they get a lot of money these days from Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, who they entered into partnership with about 2.5 years ago.
Precisely, and I think this is where one has to take the broader lens. Yes, you look at what's happening between Yemen and Saudi. You look at what's happening between Iran and America, or America and Russia, and China. But actually, there's a wider lens you've got to put into it, which is to do with those guys who are the money lenders and the usurers and the people who control trade around the world. A couple of companies, including Vanguard, seem to have a huge say on what happens in the economics of the world, which is quite frightening.
BlackRock, I think.
BlackRock, yes, BlackRock and Vanguard. So, when you see that there are companies, corporate companies, and there are individuals like Schwab who are their voice pieces, arguably, at the World Economic Forum, and then you see the IMF, and you look at the World Trade Organization and the way it's structured and the way the World Bank operates, and you can see that most of their policies are geared towards really subjugating and controlling nations and taking resources. So,
it's a bit like this. Sorry to interrupt you again, but this World Economic Forum thing is almost a bit like the deregulation of the planet. The UN was supposed to be the place where things get discussed, on an even keel between different nations. And of course, it's very important for maintaining peace through the Security Council. But all of a sudden, when you get Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum involved, it's a kind of privatization of that whole process.
And that's the whole world. I mean, and this is where I think that the real conversation has to be had. That we're being constantly told by mainstream media to look at these what I call symptoms, the symptoms of the problem, the actual global problem. The global problem being the control of money and the control of the commons and the control of our resources generally.
Well, plunging many of our governments and us into debt.
Of course. And, Britain is now, I think, 3 trillion in debt. The Americans are in about 30 trillion debt. And nobody ever asks that very simple question. I mean, who are they in debt to? And, how does this debt accumulate? And how can it possibly happen to the richest nation in the world? I mean, America is the richest nation in the world. And if the richest nation in the world is in debt, then we've got to look at what's wrong with, capitalism and neoliberalism and the policies which are creating a world that seems to be increasingly divided by very wealthy and very poor. That seems to be
Yeah, let's just go back up north to Ukraine, because there's been so much in the news, and yet it seems to me it's in the news, it's in acres and acres of newsprint, and yet none of the basic facts seem to be being discussed at all. We had all this talk in the middle of the week, I think it was Wednesday morning, about a false flag attack that was supposed to be happening. Martin Summers and I, and I'm sure yourself, are quite familiar with this, and we've talked about the September the 11th attacks as being a false flag attack, the 7/7 London bombings as being a false flag attack. That is to say that these were attacks that were carried out actually with the cooperation, at the very least, of the security services, the intelligence services, and to some extent the police within those countries, in order to create a kind of a policy change. And really, they were aimed at the opinion formers and the politicians in that country to get that policy change. But with Ukraine, I mean, it really just simply doesn't add up at all, because it was inside the north of the border, which is in official Ukraine. Apparently, this attack took place, artillery fired from the Donbass region into hitting a kindergarten, which luckily there were no children in there. But how on earth can that be a false flag attack? Because that would imply that the Ukrainians had attacked themselves.
Well, it's not that shocking or surprising, because, first of all, we assume and presume that nations' governments are operating in the interests of their own nations.
Yeah, but Syed, I'm just talking about the logic of this news story. We're being told that the Russians have done a false flag attack, but actually the attack has taken place within Ukraine itself. So, if it's going to be a false flag attack, surely the Ukrainians are going to be doing that attack on themselves. It's almost as if they've given the game away, and they're hoping and crossing their fingers and hoping that no one will notice.
Well, I think this is like where they're getting, beyond even fiction, and then just sort of bringing almost Hollywood right into the real world. And they do get away with it, Tony, because the fact of the matter is that the critical reasoning or the critical inquiry doesn't take place. The media does get given a line. Journalists are told they can go to certain issues and not others, and there are news lines which are given, and if the news line is not going to investigate or pursue the investigation, then you're not going to get it. You're not going to get your report aired anyway. And,
well, no, you're right. I mean, can I just bring Martin Summers in on this, because this is one of the most extraordinary international news stories I've ever seen this week. A false flag attack, apparently, by the Russians on Ukraine, but the Ukrainians. I mean, surely that's just a normal attack. It's not a false flag attack, isn't it?
Well, there are a number of questions about this particular situation. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of fighting along the ceasefire line in the last 48 hours, and that's been going on for 7 years. But there's definitely been a spike, and the danger now. I mean, obviously, there's been this drumbeat that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and the Russians are saying no, we're not, and they're saying yes, you are. No, we're not. And what may happen here is that the Ukrainian army have got 100,000 troops on the border of the breakaway republics, and they want to provoke a war so that the Russians are then provoked into intervening, so that they can sanction the Nordstream II pipeline, sever the links between, potential links between Germany and Russia, all of which is, grist to the mill of what Syed was saying about, this is a geopolitical contest for control of resources. It's imperialism by any other name. But this particular kindergarten attack, let's do a bit of detail on that for a minute. I was looking at stuff today. If you actually look at the photograph of where the missile or whatever it was, artillery shell has hit the kindergarten, but none of the windows in the kindergarten are broken, which is just impossible. And of course, we got similar stuff in Syria, in Ghouta, where they were going, and also
So it is okay. So what you're suggesting here is it is a false flag attack by Kiev on themselves,
yes,
trying to make it look as if it's the Russians.
I cannot prove that, but that's what it looks like. And we know that Western intelligence services working, because a lot of what they do now is what they call narrative, controlling the narrative. So we've got Brigade 77 in Britain, which has over 1,000 employees, apparently, all of them army officers, and they spend all day trying to bend the media to certain things, so that, and it's all part of the information battle space and all the rest of it.
Well, I actually, let me just share this with you, because I was sitting in a cafe a few weeks ago, and next to me in the cafe were two guys who did sound like these kind of information warfare people, having a conversation about various stories that they were getting into newspapers and things like that. And he said, well, one of the guys said to the other guys, well, he said, well, they had the temerity to actually question what we were saying, and so we made a note of their names, blah blah blah. You know, so this is their attitude: is that when they put a story out, they do not expect any kind of criticism or changes and challenge to that story by the mass media whatsoever. So, and they were making a note of the people and the names of the people within the media who had actually questioned that they shouldn't just be maybe just putting this information out verbatim without questioning it.
Well, if you're asking me, the mainstream media on Ukraine have basically taken the Western intelligence services word for everything.
But this propaganda, really, to me, is almost off the scale. I've never seen anything quite so ridiculous. We've heard for 3 weeks solid, pretty much, that the Russians are about to invade Ukraine. They're about to invade Ukraine. There's no reason why they could, why they should. What is the... I mean, I'll ask you this as the same question in a minute, Syed. So, Martin, what do you think the reasons for it are? You mentioned there Germany and Nordstream II. Yeah. So what you seem to be saying is that this is not really a story about Ukraine. It's a story about Germany. Interesting.
Yes, ultimately. Why is it different now? I mean, the Russian army has always been there in the west of Russia. I mean, that's where they're based, you know, and they could, in theory, invade the Ukraine. They could have done that in 2014. They haven't, because it's not in Russia's interest. The last thing they want to do is get bogged down in the Ukraine. I mean, where they're likely to do things. I mean, Shoigu yesterday went to Syria. I don't
think they would necessarily get bogged down. They would move in and they would take Ukraine, and then they would sort of halt wherever they felt that they wanted to.
Well, but they don't want to do it. I think that's pretty clear. They could, but they don't want to.
Or might they, if they, for example, their NATO moved missiles in close to Moscow?
I think the way they're going to, it's not just about Ukraine, as Syed was saying earlier. What's probably Shoigu, for example, they're saying they're going to invade in the next 48 hours, but the Russian defense minister is actually in Syria, because that's where the Russians are going to make their counter move, probably. They may drive the US out of Syria as a punishment for what they're suffering in the Ukraine. But I mean, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is basically the future. You know, Russia's got the natural resources, Germany's got the technology, and, you know, ultimately, you know, it makes sense for those two things to be brought together. And that was the case in the 1990s when Chancellor Kohl had Herrhausen, who was the head of the Deutsche Bank, going backwards and forwards to Gorbachev, discussing what they were going to do when the Soviet Union was opened up. And, of course, Herrhausen eventually was murdered by the Red Brigades, which were not the Red Brigades, the Red Army faction. Red Army faction, yeah. Which was basically the Americans. And, of course, that sent a message to the Germans: you're not to do deals with the Russians without our permission. It
seems to me Ukraine is also about trying to speed along Ukraine's membership of NATO, maybe. But anyway, Syed, what are your thoughts about the real reasons for this wall-to-wall propaganda?
Well, I think, the economic reasons, I mean, most of the arms dealers will be licking their lips, won't they? Because another Cold War starts and we're all going to be quids in, as far as they're concerned. So I wouldn't ignore that as a motive for creating this kind of saber rattling, if you like, that's going on essentially. But I'm going to move away from Europe, because the implications on a global level of what's going on in Ukraine are there as well. I mean, for instance, let's take Iran, Israel, the impact on Syria, as my colleague did just raise as well. There are implications there, and the Ukrainian standoff essentially does potentially upset the kind of informal agreement that the Russians, the Israelis, and the Americans have in Syria about those little borderlines there. So there's a potential knock-on for the situation reigniting in Syria in a bigger way. the Iranians would be probably the ones who are the biggest winners from this at the moment, because with them negotiating the JCPOA with the Americans and the Americans getting increasingly distracted here, of course, there's every chance that the pressure is off them, which the Americans and the Israelis have been desperately doing with similar propaganda against Iran for several years now, if not decades. But of course, Israel has relations with Ukraine and has relations with Russia. Israel has, I think, something like 250,000 Jews living in Russia and about 50,000 in Ukraine. So they'll have to eventually, if it gets worse, they eventually have to show their hand as to whose side they're on, because at the moment they sit in both camps in a way, but eventually they'll ultimately have to go back to their real benefactors, the Americans. So if things really became difficult, that would mean they would have to side more and more with the Ukrainians and with the Americans, and therefore Russia would seriously consider lifting its kind of kid gloves, because it virtually allows Israel to bomb Syria at will. It has done anyway, and it has its S-400s stationed there. It doesn't use them against Israel. Even had an
hang on, these are anti-aircraft missiles.
Yes, anti-aircraft missiles, which the Russians have. They've actually transferred them to Syria, but they've never been used in anger.
I wonder if they ever even switched them on.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very, very unlikely. But these are all issues.
Well, they would come up in the cockpit, wouldn't it? Target found, at least that would send them a message. But look, sorry to divert you, but I'm going to go back to just revisit the JCPOA, because I think was anyway the most important piece of paper on the planet. Reuters has reported yesterday that the draft agreement between the US and Iran would involve mutual steps for both sides to take. So there at least is some sort of hope there, according to the Americans. They're saying, well, look, the diplomats, unnamed diplomats, say the first phase of the draft deal includes the release of Western prisoners in Iran. It makes no mention of the release of Iranian prisoners that are held in the United States. But at least there's, what do you think's happening with this? Because Biden did say he was going to rejoin it, didn't he?
Well, firstly, the JCPOA and the Iranian issue is really, in many ways, something which now the Americans are being forced to sort of back off on, actually, because they pulled out unilaterally in 2018 without any real reason. Now they have been desperately trying to get Iran on its knees with what they've called maximum pressure and the economic sanctions. Really, absolutely stunning and very, very powerful economic sanctions. But they've not managed to bring Iran to its knees. In fact, what they're worried about is Iran is becoming more and more a resistance economy and being able to develop even more technological, agricultural, and other development issues. And at the same time, while the Americans have been playing this game of economic terrorism against Iran, Iran's been cutting deals with China, and they've just gone and done something like a $500 billion deal, building transport networks, etc. The Russians are also doing deals and trade deals with Iran, and at the same time, they're running military naval drills. Only last few weeks ago. So what you're seeing is the Eurasian axis. You're seeing the rise of a new counterweight potentially to America and its allies on a global level. And I think that's something which the Americans, by being so deferential to Israeli interests, are almost forcing Iran to move into that camp. And by taking on Russia and China, they're almost making this alliance firmer and firmer. And I think that's where they have to now consider what they're doing, because if they continue the line they've got, then Iran will walk away. And yes, they'll suffer as well with sanctions, but they'll continue to use what they got, all the informal resistance economy techniques, and they will continue to fight an asymmetric warfare right across West Asia, which will bleed America in terms of its military and its occupation of Iraq and its interests in Saudi and across the whole region. And it will also leave Israel more and more vulnerable, because if the Americans cannot maintain a long-term hold and support in that region, then how long is it till Israel itself becomes absolutely, capable of being brought down by the likes of the resistance axis on its borders.
I mean, you, as a journalist, I'm sure are quite aware of the shutdown of RT over in Germany. Now, this, I think, is also, I mean, we're talking about the whole Ukraine thing being about Germany, but the idea that the German-speaking version of RT is no more. I mean, they're trying to resurrect it at the moment, but it could be that that's gone forever. That's a massively important move, I think.
It's a very worrying thing because, the censorship that's going on across media, the control of the media, has never been as kind of tight and as totalitarian as far as I can see. And, it is frightening that now actually sometimes it's just so brazen that we're not being allowed to hear voices. We're not being allowed to hear certain narratives. When in my day when we grew up, or in the journalistic field, the whole idea was you had 2 or 3 sets of opinions and you let the audience make up their mind. But it seems that even with the media outlets that we thought were the most independent in the world, apparently, they're now brazenly just doing such things, but shutting down RT, I mean, it sets a terrible precedent. I mean, they've done it to Press TV as well over a minor issue, I remember, and other channels also get censored. I mean, we've seen it within the whole anti-Semitic card that's been used to shut down voices as well. So it's on the political front as well. You can use all sorts of techniques and cause célèbres or emotional issues, inflate them and start shutting down voices. But Russia being shut down, well, of course, Russia, I think the RT probably was spending, I think the BBC spent about 2 billion a year. I think the RT, I've heard their budget is around 500 million. But they did a pretty good job of it. I mean, RT had a huge audience, and that would worry Western powers.
I mean, it's a terrific point that you make, because actually, many of these Western broadcasters, the CNNs, etc., are paying an absolute fortune, maybe 10 times more for actually a far worse service, because if you're going to put out nonsense, you need to put a lot more time and effort into it, because it needs to be quite sophisticated, rather than just allow people to speak. And one of the things you find in all sorts of totalitarian countries is they simply steer well clear of any kind of live broadcasts, because they know that people might say the wrong thing. They have blacklists to keep all sorts of people off the airwaves, such as, for example, they've done at the BBC with poor old Robert Fisk before he died. He was a brilliant reporter, but they wouldn't allow him on anywhere because they didn't know what he was going to say. Now, this to me is not, the way that mass media managers should operate. There are various others, but Martin, this is an important part of all of this, isn't it? The idea that you can, for example, you would do lots of pre-recorded programs, where you have to sort of record somebody, you have to then edit them, you have to check it, you have to double check it, and this demands a lot more money. We're hearing, something like 10 times more money is actually spent on the propaganda side, the Western side, the big mass media of the CNNs, etc., than the Russians have done at RT.
Well, obviously, because I'm a fairly regular contributor on RT, so obviously I'm slightly biased. But what they've done there is very good, because what they've done is they broadcast in English, and they're giving an alternative view, and they've managed to establish a fairly big audience for that. And it just by existing and having alternative interpretations of events. And also the kind of, it's pitched at a fairly high level, RT. It's not, they expect, it's like a Raytheon principle. We're going to talk in a sensible tone of voice and at some length. And we're really trying to communicate with people who are interested in detail rather than just broad sweeps of, propagandistic, statements. And that is effective, because the other side really, all this stuff that was pushing in the media last week, that the Russians were going to invade at 3 a.m. on Wednesday. And of course, that just turned out to be an absolute load of nonsense. It was all based upon the US intelligence saying, we can't tell you, but we know that the Russians are going to invade at 3 a.m. on Wednesday.
Yeah, well, there's
a series of, all these nodding dogs just repeated what they've been told
there's a
by the American government.
Terrific article on antiwar.com on their blog. Conflicts of interests, it starts, and it says, Putin disappoints Biden on invasion day side.
Yeah, it's almost like we're living in a scripted drama, kind of a theatre act, and it literally is. I mean, I know from a little bit of knowledge around, for instance, the PREVENT program and the government's rollout of counter-terrorism policy here in Britain, and there were sort of think tanks that popped out of nowhere, well-funded, financed by neocons and with money trails. Policy Exchange was one of them, and Henry Jackson Society, all sorts of people were involved. And there they had a desk. They'd have a media guy sitting there who knew all the chaps in editorial, departments around the different channels, and his job was to get his press releases out. His job was to persuade editors, etc., and sometimes to possibly even pull in favours or even twist arms. Now, to what extent is the deep state involved in bullying media as well? Because, if you feel, for instance, with the Edward Snowden thing, or if you look at Assange, or you look at the whole notion of surveillance capitalism now, you start bringing in this issue of, agencies being able to eavesdrop. Pegasus, the system that the Israelis have, has literally hit 169 or so journalists, that are known. They've eavesdropped on hundreds and hundreds of NGOs, politicians, haven't been spared. So if you've got agencies, known agencies like Unit 8200 over at Mossad in Israel, just for example, GCHQ and all these guys, they're operating, and yet we have no real recourse to being able to hold them to account, because they will pull the national interest card, won't they? Because the journalists won't be able to go so far, so that they can literally get away with whatever they want, and they can potentially cover it up. So I think this is deeply worrying for a democratic Western citizenry, yet when we have no real say in the matter of how we're surveyed, what level. Cambridge Analytica was a huge issue. It came and it went. These issues come and they become like issues that the media has a storm about. But what actually gets done? What laws are passed to protect us? What laws are passed to protect journalists? What would make journalists become afraid or frightened of what intelligence agencies could do to them when they have information about them researching a perfectly honest story? I mean, I'd say that many journalists would rather just want their pay packet and now wouldn't go for the story in its true essence, and that is a violation of our I think democracy.
Well, that's right. I mean, this whole business of surveillance is, it's basically the technology has way overtaken the legislation, and what we've seen is also the legal system, the court system, under surveillance. We see our lawmakers, our MPs, under surveillance. Anyway, look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, Syed. I'd just like to leave the field totally open to you to bring up any topic you'd like whatsoever, really, that you think would be useful to bring to our attention. I know, it's a very wide question, but you're obviously you follow all sorts of stuff, and I wonder what you make of absolutely anything. I'll leave it open to you.
Well, thank you very much. But I would try to really raise the concern that actually what was a democratic West, which was heading in the direction of, a very balanced society in many ways with the welfare state and whatnot, we're now, I think, at a crossroads. We're on the precipice of losing all of that which we gained, whether that was artificially gained or not. And I would say what's termed the Great Reset, and what's termed the Agenda 2030 at the United Nations, and what the World Economic Forum has been pushing as this Great Reset, and adding that to the absolutely huge knowledge base which is now emerging, and technologies that are emerging in terms of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, robotic engineering, and the information technology that is there. I think that we need to really wake up and join the dots, because all these things are happening in silos and in separate silos. But we get distracted by viruses, and we get distracted by terrorism, we get distracted by Russia versus Ukraine. But underlying it all, there is, I believe, the danger that those who have always maintained power and money and wealth have a very clear discerning direction and destination for the West, the Western powers, the erstwhile powers of this planet. And it seems as though there's a downgrade going on economically, and it seems to me that there's a general dumbing down of millennials in terms of what they're willing to accept. There's a dumbing down of what our rights are. There's a dumbing down of what our expectations should be economically. And I really do think that a lot of it is engineered. It's like economic and political engineering, which artificially is creating a lot of this situation. And we need to look far more closely at the Corporation of London and the city and its role, the Wall Streets of the world and the World Economic Forum. I think that we shouldn't be doing what mainstream media does, which is to take us towards the symptoms of the problem. Go to the root of the problem, and it's always somewhere to do with usury, money lenders, and those that have power and their interests. And unless we, as journalists, unless we as citizens turn our attention to the real, I think, potential root causes, we're just going to constantly be puppets that are buffeted around by the agendas and the programming and the engineering, be it through wars or scaring us about Muslims or scaring us about coronaviruses, all of which possibly exist. There are threats, but the way that the media has played its role and the way that the military, the industrial military complex plays its role, and the way that the politicians and the banksters play their role is really quite frightening. And I think that we need to really take stock of what we want the future to be and to dream of a more moral, a more if you like, a more ethical future based on our values, our traditional values.
Yeah, but hang on, Syed, I know what you're saying, but against that you've got Klaus Schwab, who seems to want to be king of the world. It's almost like we're going back to this massive kind of feudal system right across the planet. But he has decided the way things are going to go. As things start to collapse, he is going to be the guy to rebuild it alongside Prince Charles. This great reset is going to be fantastic, and everyone's going to be basically doing a new system which he has designed.
Well, I think the critical thing is that if we were producing from our schools people who were real critical thinkers and who could join the dots and understood politics and understood how the elitist mechanism works, which sadly we do not. We have an educated society, but we are politically quite illiterate. We're economically pretty illiterate, spiritually pretty illiterate, I would say, as a people, even though we're supposed to be, literate in the academic sense. It frightens me to see how easily the establishment has managed to steer and veer us. And I think that the problem now for us is really how to get people to understand that if you withdraw consent to a lot of the tyranny, and what I call it tyranny, it is tyranny, and the sort of the taking away of our rights. It takes bravery and courage to say, actually, you know what, I'm not going to participate in your system, and I will withdraw consent on as many things as I possibly can. And on an individual level, look for alternatives. The resistance you have towards that surveillance capitalism tyranny, we still do have the power on an individual level to withdraw and not to buy into their sort of transnational corporations, their products, their business, and that requires more guts, which is to say, actually, I'm not going to buy into the material diversions, because it's those habits and addictions to all of the things that they serve up. And now we've got Facebook and etc. going to the metaverse. So you've got virtual realities coming up. People are going to be living in virtual realities, probably not working in jobs, because there won't be any unless you're a really super techie or you're just a down and out sort of worker on the ground. So in the middle, you're going to have a load of vacant people. So they're either got to push depopulation agendas where, we don't produce as many kids, so they don't have to manage as many of us, or they're going to have to entertain us and divert us to all these kind of other entertainment products that we don't need to be such a burden, because they just won't have jobs.
Well, I mean, a lot of this entertainment, I'm afraid, is nothing like the entertainment that I grew up with, and in fact, it's not even funny. But anyway, look, Syed Mosin Abbas, maybe you could just round off by letting us know whereabouts we can find you and follow you online.
Well, I'm on Facebook, Syed Mosin Abbas. I'm very often on Press TV. That's the Iranian state television. So I get entertained 4 or 5 times a week on different issues there. But I'm mainly, I can be found on Twitter, all under Syed Mosin Abbas, and all the usual Instagrams, etc. If anybody's interested in knowing more, I'm always very, very, very happy to connect.
And yeah, it's nice to hear you saying that. I mean, of course, this is happening, isn't it? The Canadian truckers, the French truckers we'll be hearing about in a minute as well. People are actually starting to get their act together and say, well, hang on, we're not having this. So anyway, Syed Mosin Abbas, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers. Anyway, so, right, Martin, we're going to hear now from Dr. Stanley Laham on our second item of part 2, which is all about this whole idea that there is no such thing as a virus. This is this thing called the film called Terrain, with Dr. Andrew Kaufman and I can't remember the guy's name anyway, Dr. Tom Cowan, who say there is no such thing as a virus, and actually everything that we've learnt since Pasteur is wrong. So we had Catherine Gunn talking about that last week. She doesn't want to speak to us this week, but anyway, she's too busy or something. But anyway, we're going to have the opposite point of view, that is to say that there most definitely are such things as viruses. And here's Dr. Stanley Laham to explain. If someone is saying that viruses don't exist, we should be replete with masses of evidence that they do.
We are replete with masses of evidence that they do exist. If I may say something myself, let me tell you how I discovered the virus that I discovered.